Imagine, outside, it is -30. The wind from the plains strikes horizontally, not just cold, but a solid wall of ice. There is no down jacket, no gas boiler, not even a proper double-glazed window. And at the same time, you are not just surviving. You are well-fed, you are warm. Around you live several dozen people. In the enclosure stands a horse. In pits under the floor, grain supplies for the entire winter. And the house you are sitting in has stood on this spot for 200 years, and it was built in 7 days, without a single nail. This is not a yurt, not a chum, not a cave. This is an earth lodge, one of the most underestimated architectural survival systems ever created by humanity, and almost no one talks about it. Today, we do.
To understand why one would build a house out of earth at all, you first have to understand the place. The Great Plains of North America are not that romantic picture with cowboys, hills, and a sunset over the steppe. In winter, this is a place where temperatures drop to -30 and lower, where the wind does not stop for weeks, where there are practically no trees, only grass, horizon, and cold. Right here, along the Missouri River and its tributaries, in the territory of present-day North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, dozens of peoples lived: the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Pawnee. Today, they are commonly grouped under the term Plains Village Tribes, and that already says a lot about who they were.
They were not nomads. They did not move after herds of bison, did not set up tents and take them down the next morning. They built permanent villages. They grew corn, beans, and squash. They kept horses. They traded with neighbors across hundreds of kilometers. Their villages sometimes numbered 1,000, even 2,000 people. And the center of each such village were earth lodges. The first detailed written description of these structures was left by Patrick Gass, a participant in the famous Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. He saw these houses and honestly wrote he had seen nothing like them in the Old World. And he was right.
So, how was it constructed? We peel it back layer by layer, literally. The first thing that catches the eye is the shape, round, dome-shaped. And this is not accidental. A circle has the minimum ratio of perimeter to area. Simply put, with the same area, a round house has a smaller outer surface through which heat escapes. This is pure geometry, and it works. The diameter of such a house is from 9 to 18 meters. There are reports of ceremonial structures with a diameter of more than 27 meters, the largest buildings on the plains until the 20th century. The height is from 3 to 4.5 meters. This is not a small burrow. This is a full-fledged space. But even before they started putting up the walls, they did something important. They recessed the floor by 30, sometimes by 60 centimeters below ground level. Why? Because the earth at depth, even in the fiercest frosts, keeps a temperature much higher than the surface. This is not magic and not an accident. This is thermal mass, a phenomenon that modern physics described much later than the Mandan began to use it.
Next, the frame. First, the men set up 4 large central posts made of cottonwood, the only large tree that grew along the rivers of the plains. Crossbeams were attached to them. Then, a ring of shorter perimeter posts, and from the central beams to the perimeter, rafters extended radially, like spokes in a wheel. On top of this wooden skeleton, the layers began. First, dense weaving of willow branches and reeds. Then, a layer of prairie grass. And finally, what gave the house its name, a layer of sod and clay, from 60 centimeters to almost a meter thick. The walls, similarly, sod and clay over a pole framework. The entrance to the house was always oriented to the east, toward the morning sun. But here is a detail that at first glance seems minor, yet is actually a real engineering solution. The entrance was tunnel-like, a corridor 2 to 4.5 meters long, narrowed, low. This is not just a passage, it is an airlock. Cold air does not enter directly, but is forced to turn around several corners. During this time, it warms up slightly.
a small detail. In winter, at -30, not a small detail at all. And finally, the opening in the roof, in the center of the dome. In winter, it was covered with a bison hide, leaving a small gap for smoke. In rain or snow, it was covered with a special shield on a pole. This entire structure was built in about 7 to 10 days, without nails, without metal, only local materials, wood, willow, grass, earth. And it served for 20 to 30 years. Then a new one was built.
Here it is necessary to pause and explain the physics, because without it, this whole story sounds like they buried themselves in the ground and somehow didn't freeze. In reality, it is a much more complex system. Earth is a poor thermal insulator in the usual sense, but it has enormous thermal capacity. It absorbs heat very slowly and releases it very slowly. Compare, a thin layer of foam will stop heat flow quickly, but it has no heat storage. Earth is the opposite. It absorbs heat from the fire for weeks and months, stores it, and then slowly releases it back. This is a thermal flywheel. It spins up slowly and slows down slowly. Add to this one more fact. At a depth of 1 to 2 meters, the ground temperature in North Dakota, even in the harshest winter, stays around 0 or slightly below. But not -20 or 30 like on the surface. This means that the floor of the house and the lower parts of the walls are effectively heated by the ground without any fire. And when snow settled on top, it added another layer. Loose snow retains heat better than many modern materials. In winter, the earth lodge was literally buried under snow and became even warmer. And the round shape, warm air from the fire, rose along the dome upward and did not spread into corners like in a rectangular house, but circulated evenly inside the dome. Smoke went out through the upper opening. Heat remained below. The result of all this, at -30 outside, inside a well-heated earth lodge, it was from +10 to +20 degrees. Not a 5-star hotel, but a completely livable environment for normal human life. Now, a point that is usually not in textbooks, and one that completely changes the picture. The Earth Lodge was built by women. Not assisted. Built. Men cut and hauled the large posts and beams. That was indeed heavy physical labor, but everything else, weaving the willow, laying the grass, applying the layers of sod and clay, shaping the dome, all of this was done by women, under the guidance of the elder women of the community. And from this followed a direct legal consequence. The house was considered the property of the woman, not the man, the woman. Among the Mandan and Hidatsa, the house was built by a woman, managed by a woman, and if the marriage ended, the man walked out the door, and the woman remained in her house. Thanks to one woman, we know much more about all this than we otherwise could. In 1911, Presbyterian minister Gilbert Wilson began recording Hidatsa knowledge and became friends with a woman named Buffalo Bird Woman. Thanks to her accounts, detailed descriptions were preserved of how earth lodges were built, how the 3 sisters were cultivated, and how household life was organized in the conditions of a plains winter. These records are kept in the archives of the Minnesota Historical Society and are one of the most important primary sources on this topic. In 1833, the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer traveled along the Missouri and sketched the interior of a Mandan earth lodge. This is one of the most valuable visual documents of the era. Let's step inside together with him. Through the tunnel entrance, and immediately you feel the difference. Warmth. Not heat, but a completely different world compared to outside. The center of the room is the hearth, a shallow depression in the floor, surrounded by stones. Above it, open all the way to the roof opening. Smoke goes upward, but not all of it. Some remains under the dome. The eyes adjust. The forehead waters slightly. This is inevitable. Around the hearth, 4 massive central posts. They support the entire structure, and the Hidatsa believed that the spirit of the house lived in them. Along the outer walls, platform beds, raised 30 to 40 centimeters above the floor. And this is not just convenience. Cold air settles along the floor, so it is always warmer higher up. The beds are separated from the rest of the space by hides, personal space in a house where 20 to 60 people live. Between the beds and the walls, storage space, bows,
weapons, tools, pots. Closer to the entrance, firewood. Young men also sleep there. They must be the first to react to danger. And in the floor, storage pits, bell-shaped, narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, from 1 to 2.5 meters deep. There, grain, dried meat, roots. In winter, these pits function as a refrigerator and protect supplies from moisture and rodents. On the wall opposite the entrance, an altar, a sacred zone. Among the Pawnee, it symbolized the star goddess. In the first ray of the morning sun through the tunnel entrance on the day of the spring equinox fell directly on it. The Earth Lodge was not just a house, it was at the same time a universe, an observatory, and a temple.
But a warm house without food is just a warm tomb. So the survival system was not limited to architecture alone. The basis of the diet was the so-called Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. This is not just a set of crops, it is a brilliant agronomic system. Corn grows vertically and provides structure. Beans climb up it and at the same time enrich the soil with nitrogen. The broad leaves of squash cover the ground between the stalks, retain moisture, and suppress weeds. The three crops together produce more food and exhaust the soil less than any of them separately. Modern agronomy would call this companion planting, and for a long time considered itself its discoverer. Corn and beans were dried and stored in storage pits where they could last for years. Squash was cut into strips and dried in the sun. And in summer and autumn, men went hunting for bison, sometimes very far away. The meat was dried and turned into a dense concentrate that weighed several times less than fresh meat. In winter, it was boiled into corn soup, a caloric, fatty, hot food, exactly what is needed at -30.
By the way, these same Mandan and Hidatsa were well-known traders across the plains. Nomadic tribes, Lakota, Crow, Assiniboine, came to their villages to exchange bison hides for corn and beans. Earth lodges stood at the center of trade networks that covered hundreds of kilometers. These were not isolated settlements, they were hubs of an entire region. And one more detail that cannot be missed. Earth lodges never stood alone. They were built densely, in clusters, the roofs of neighboring houses almost touching each other. In winter, this meant additional insulation, fewer walls exposed to the outside. And around large villages, a ditch was dug and an earthen wall was raised. The famous Huff village, a Mandan settlement of the 15th, 16th centuries, had 115 large houses and more than 1,000 inhabitants, with a powerful defensive ditch around it. Dense construction, rampart, ditch, armed guards at the entrances, and Earth Lodge village was at the same time a communal home and a fortified camp.
Now the part without which this story would be incomplete, and it is Tiajalea. June 1837. A steamboat of the American Fur Company docked at the trading post Fort Clark. On board were people sick with smallpox. The passengers went ashore. Trade took place. The steamboat moved on. A few weeks passed. The 4th of July. The first death in a Mandan village. The 14th of July. The fort manager, Francis Chardon, wrote in his diary that a young Mandan man had died of smallpox and that several others were already infected. August. Chardon writes that he is keeping count of the dead, but they are dying so fast that it is almost impossible.
By October 1837, out of approximately 1,600 Mandan who lived in 2 villages, between 27 and 150 people survived, depending on the source. 90% of the people in 4 months. Among the neighboring Hidatsa, a third died. Among the Arikara, half. Empty earth lodges stood for years. The wind moved through the collapsed roofs. Centers of trade across thousands of kilometers fell silent. This was not the inevitable collapse of a civilization. It was a specific tragedy with specific circumstances and with a specific context. The American Congress had already passed a law on vaccination of indigenous peoples in 1832,
but the Upper Missouri tribes were deliberately excluded from it. The surviving Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara united. They exist today as the 3 affiliated tribes and retain rights to their lands in North Dakota.
The Earth Lodge as a building type disappeared at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. New materials, new conditions, but not forgotten. In the first decade of the 21st century, the 3 affiliated tribes at the Fort Berthold Reservation built an entire village of 6 family earth lodges and 1 ceremonial one, more than 27 meters in diameter, the first such village built by members of the tribe in more than 100 years. The National Park Service built a replica earth lodge at the site of Knife River Indian villages. You can go there and step inside. But there is also a broader lesson in this whole story.
The Earth Lodge is an example of what can be called engineering without universities. People without thermodynamics as a science, without building codes and architectural faculties, through millennia of observation and selection, created a system that uses the thermal mass of the Earth instead of active heating, minimizes heat loss through geometry, protects from wind through form and orientation, and combines living, storage, social, and sacred functions in one space. Modern researchers of underground and earth-sheltered houses refer to these principles as a precursor of passive architecture. What the Mandan and Pawnee devised, we rediscovered in the 20th century and called it earth-sheltered housing.
Winter of 1804-1805. Lewis and Clark are wintering at Fort Mandan, a few kilometers from the Mandan villages. The temperature drops to -40. The American explorers are freezing in their wooden barracks. A few kilometers from them, thousands of people sit in warmth in round earth lodges. They eat corn soup with bison meat, and probably wonder, why didn't these strange people build themselves a proper house? A good question.